Hello, everybody, and welcome or welcome back to the second shelf and to another Recent Reads on Sunday, in which I discuss, the video in which I discuss the books that I've recently finished or started or am still working on. And it's a beautiful day today after the start of spring, and we just had the time switch to daylight saving time, summertime as we call it here in Europe. We are 2 weeks after you guys who live in the US. But now we are on the same side again, and I hate the switch when I always realize too late on Saturday, late in the evening or, around midnight something, that it's actually for the sleep thing already 1 o'clock and that I have an hour less to sleep. Anyway, other than that, it's spring and we should be happy. On to the books. The first book I want to talk to you about that I finished is a nonfiction book, Laura Kaplan, The Story of Jane, the legendary underground feminist abortion service, published in 1996. The underground abortion service that this book is talking about is, of course, in Chicago, the Jane organization, where a group of women between the end of the 1960s and before Roe v. Wade in 1973 helped women to get a safe and medically sound abortion. So they had a network of doctors or medical practitioners who could perform abortions, and women who wanted abortions could contact this network and they would arrange the meeting with the doctor, and also give financial help if possible, because an abortion even back then was expensive, $500, which is not a small amount, certainly not in the late 1960s for women who don't have much or any money. Anyway, I really enjoyed this book. It was a bit different from what I thought it would be. I thought it would be more of a kind of cool history of that organization. But in fact, Laura Kaplan was one of the women in that organization. And it's much more a story about the various women who joined the organization. There were more than 100 women over the course of the existence of this organizations. And of course, it's not all of them in the book, but Laura Kaplan talked to women, her colleagues back then. And it's really more of a group memoir, if you will, of this time and the women who got engaged in that project. I really thought it was a very worthwhile read for this part of history that you don't hear much about. So if you're interested in that type of book, like I said, a sort of a group memoir, then I can certainly recommend it. Like I said, I definitely enjoyed it, and I'm glad I read it. The next book, also nonfiction. I think all the books that I finished were nonfiction. Can you believe it? The next book is a very short, slim little book by Leonora Carrington, Down Below, first published in 1945. Leonora Carrington was an important surrealist painter and novelist. She lived most of her life in Mexico. And because I asked that myself, whether she was family with Dora Carrington, another painter, an English British painter, but there's no relation. Anyway, so Leonora Carrington in the late 1930s met a much older Max Ernst, then also really important figure in the Surrealist movement that just started in the 1930s, and they became a couple. And then, of course, the Nazi occupation of France. They lived in France, and then the Nazi occupation happened, and Max Ernst, who was Jewish, was interned in concentration camps twice, and Leonora fled to Mexico and had a psychotic breakdown. She was hospitalized in a mental hospital. And this book, Down Below, is about that time. It's in the form of diary entries, if you will, written afterwards, after the fact. And the Down Below is a place of refuge, not a real place, but a place in her mind of refuge, because the treatment and what she experienced is pretty harsh. The whole surrealist approach to madness is just not my thing. That's why some of the reflections on madness are just, for me, difficult to grasp. But the writing is fantastic, and the way that Carrington is able to convey what it means to be quote unquote mad, is harrowing. So I recommend this with a kind of a little bit of hesitation, because, like I said, of this surrealist adoration for madness, which I don't share, because what she experienced was just horrible. And then the last book I want to talk to you about that I finished, like I said, also nonfiction, is Mona Chollet, In Defense of Witches, Why Women Are Still on Trial, translated from the French by Sophie R. Lewis, and published in France a couple of years ago and 2 years ago, I think. Again, some things never change. I have to look that up. This year, of course, because I bought it this year because it was a new release. This year in the English translation, and 2018 indeed in the French original. Mona Chollet is a journalist who writes about feminism. So this is a feminist book. It was not quite the book I had hoped it would be. First of all, that was a misunderstanding on my side. Because of the title and because of the illustration, I thought that at least part of the book would be about the history, the witch trials, whether it's the Salem witch trials, or just more in general reflections on why women were considered to be witches and burned at the stake. Excuse me, it's not that at all. In the introduction, Chollet gives a little bit of the historical background and context. But in fact, what she does is she takes three typical reasons why women would be considered witches. That is, that they are independent, they don't have a husband, and they don't have children, so they're childless, they are old, or they are stubborn and talk back. These three types of women she looks at in the modern time. So in other words, there's a chapter on how we treat and talk about childless women, how we treat and talk about old women, and how we treat and talk about women who talk back. So that was my misunderstanding. That's not the fault of the book. But I felt that for me, having read quite a bit of feminist literature, it didn't really offer me anything exciting or new. I thought the one chapter about old women was really good and really interesting, but the rest was more a compilation of thoughts about women without any children and how we treat them, how we treat childlessness, also in literature. And I have read about that before. So it was an okay book. And maybe if you want to have a really well-written, sort of breezy introduction into certain feminist themes, then it's not a bad book. But for me, it was just an okay read and not more than that, unfortunately. Then, the books that I'm still working on, and the main one is part of this, Le Guin, The Complete Orsinian, and I'm working on the last bit, the stories. So Orsinian tales, short stories set in this made-up European country, Orsinia. Like the first one, Malafrena, is the novel set in Orsinia. I read this last year. Oh, and I'm buddy reading this like all the Le Guins with Adam, Memento Mori, because we are working our way through, making our way through all of Le Guin's work. And we read the Hainish cycle, and now we do the Orsinian. And Malafrena was not such a success for either of us. But anyway, so the Orsinia is this made-up European country in at the time of the Austrian Empire. So the Napoleon, the beginning of the 19th century. So the political environment is real, is factual, but the country she talks about, or she, sets her stories, is made up. There are 10 something stories, and we had our first check-in. Adam and I had our first check-in last week. We're taking it pretty slow, 3 stories at a time, take a week and then a check-in. And the first 3 stories I really, really enjoyed. They were, it's in fact, what she does here with the stories is they're set in various times in Orsinia. So one story is set in 1120, another is set in 1920, and it gives, in a way, these stories give you the history of this country, told in these individual stories. So we have the next check-in tomorrow for the next 3 stories, and I really am enjoying the stories much more than I did the novel Malafrena. So this is a success, a continuing success. And then last time, I should say, when I had the recent reads, I talked to you about this book, Lola Olufemi, Feminism Interrupted, a short feminist book by a British author in London, black British feminist. And I was supposed to start this book as a buddy read with Kathleen from Kathleen Ann, but Kathleen, something went wrong with the library reservation that she had for the book. It didn't work out, and now we still haven't started yet. So it's not quite true that I'm still reading this, because we haven't started yet. But we will start, because Kathleen today let me know that she finally has acquired the book, and we will start today to read it, and then have our first check-in next weekend or something. So it's sort of still reading, but not quite. But I will start the book. And then, and I forgot to mention, by the way, the books that I finished. I also finished 2 or 3 more books from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. I've now read, I think, 8 or 9, and I definitely want to make it to 8, I think, and I want to make it to 10 this month. But as you know, if you follow my channel, I do separate review videos for the books that I read from the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I want to read the whole long list before the shortlist is announced on the 27th of April. That's why I want to make it to 10 in March, and then read the remaining 6 in the first not quite 4 weeks in April. And I've started 2 more, which is to say, no, that's not entirely true. I started 1 and will start another one soon. And this was just some text message coming in. So we will just ignore that. Sorry. But the one I started already yesterday and made it a 3rd in is a debut novel, Miranda Cowley Heller, The Paper Palace, published. It's one of the books published last year, 2021. And Miranda Cowley Heller was born in 1961. an American author, and I always like it when people have, our debut author, even though they are not that young anymore. She's my age, so I love that. Because you're never too old to write your first book. That's my opinion. She worked as a director of drama for HBO, so she was more in television work. And this book is a book set in the present day, in one day, at a holiday cabin, where you have the main character, Elle, who had, just when the book opened, slept for the first time, had sex for the first time with Josh, whom she had met 40 years ago, and he was in love with her, but for reasons explained in the book, it didn't work out, and they married different people. And now 30, 40 years later, because Elle is now in her 50s, they had sex for the first time. And then we have the day developing, but of course, a main portion of the book is then backflash. We have her childhood from the 1966 when she was born, and then slowly making our way in those flashbacks to the present time. I like books with older protagonists, certainly if it's an older woman. 50 is not old in my view, because I'm more than 10 years older, but still. And I like books set on one day, even though most of those books have reflections backwards, so flashbacks. But, books like Mrs. Dalloway, that are the main story is set on this one day. I just like that. So we'll see about that one. And the other one is Leonie Ross, This One Sky Day, which is, I think, in the US called Poppy Show. And the title, The One Sky Day, is it The One Sky Day? I should get the title correct. This One Sky Day is the UK title. I have never read Leonie Ross, even though she has published extensively before this one. I don't know this author, and it is sort of a fantasy story. It's set on this island, Poppy Show, and all the people living there have kind of magical abilities. So I'm really curious because normally genre fiction doesn't make it onto the long list of literary fiction book prizes that often. I mean, you had exceptions that a thriller would make it on the Booker or on the Women's Prize, but it's not that often. So I'm really curious. And if you follow me, you know that I have difficulties with fantasy. That's not the genre's fault. I don't like the very typical fantasy, this kind of medieval type of setting. But there are fantasy books like N.K. Jemisin, the Broken Earth trilogy that I really, really love, that I think are excellent. So I have high hopes for this one, because it made it on the long list. And I will film, I think, another batch of reviews. I have already filmed one, but I will film another batch of reviews maybe next week or the week after. Beginning of April, probably. Anyway, those are the books for the recent reads on Sunday. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, I'm looking forward to your comment, even though I am behind again with answering the comments. I'm sorry. I try to catch up next week because I have a couple of days off from work, so I might be able to catch up. But let that not deter you from leaving a comment. I love reading them, and I always read them right away, but I'm sometimes not that good in answering them right away. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.